So out in California, there's a guy by the name of Joe Romance. When I first heard about him, I kind of pictured a guy who looked like Joe Exotic from Tiger King, but rather than working with tigers, he worked with bees. And I think it's important to think about the bees because this entire story is about the bees, and more specifically, honeybees. And specifically, this guy Joe Romance was dealing with somebody stealing his honeybees. And you might think that stealing honeybees is a silly crime, but actually the theft of honeybees has some serious implications on our food system. But I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself because the guy I need to tell you about is this guy Joe Romance. So yeah, Joe Romance was a commercial beekeeper out in like the Bakersfield, California area. And one day a few years back, he had about 180 beehives stolen. And this was a significant impact for Joe Romance's business because his business was taking his bees around to the various almond groves in California and using those bees to pollinate all the trees during the almond blossom season, which always happens like in January, February each year. And basically for a few short weeks every winter, the bees are in extremely high demand because there's so many almond trees, and the more bees and more pollination you have, the more almonds that get produced later in the year. And Joe Romance wasn't happy because he had 180 of his beehives stolen. But then something very fishy happened where there was this new guy who showed up in town who claimed to be a local to that Bakersfield area, and he was approaching various orchard owners and offering to give those orchard owners his bees for pollination service, and he was kind of charging a cut rate for the job too. Well, that's when Joe Romance snapped into action, and he and his friend set up a sting operation. Yes, a bee sting operation. And they posed as orchard owners, and they approached this guy, and they offered to pay top dollar to this guy for the services of his bees, but they wanted to inspect his hives. And so Joe's friend went in and inspected the hives, and lo and behold, it turned out that this guy was the guy who stole all of Joe Romance's beehives. And so Joe Romance called the cops came in, they looked at the evidence, they arrested this guy. And while this bee case was solved, it was by no means an isolated incident. Hey, how's it going there, Macho Man? You see, bee rustling is actually a really big deal. And over the last decade or so, it's been kind of a major crime, particularly in California. And oftentimes when you think of rustlers, right, you think of cattle rustlers, like out on the plains, guys like Billy the Kid stealing cattle from the big ranchers and like, whoa, easy guys, easy. And quite honestly, the bee rustlers aren't all that different. They're essentially out there stealing the animals of somebody else and using those stolen animals to turn a profit. And now you might be saying, my lord, that seems like an awful lot of work to steal honey from somebody. Honey, honey, how he thrills me. But that's where you're wrong, because the money in bee rustling isn't in the honey. It's all about the nuts and fruit.
There's always money in the banana stand!
But you see, in this modern world of agriculture that we now live in, pollination equals production. And without bees, you don't have food. You see, when it comes to agriculture, there has been no point in human history when we have been more productive than we are today. But at the same time, there's also never been a point in human history when our agriculture and our food systems have been more fragile. And so because of that, the bees are really, really important. Whether you're talking about almonds or avocados or oranges or berries, pretty much any type of fruit or nut that humans consume. In this day and age, we are heavily, heavily, heavily dependent on the bees to pollinate those plants to produce that food. And you might be saying, gosh, Morgan, how is that possible? Why is our monoculture agriculture system so reliant on bees? And the answer is because of monoculture. Not monorail, monoculture, meaning you're growing one type of plant or fruit. You see, our system of growing large quantities of a single type of food is highly efficient, but it also significantly impairs the biodiversity of the ecosystem. And so if you were to go back, say 150 years, what you would find is that, there was a lot of biodiversity in California, and there were a lot of natural pollinators that existed. But if you're looking at, say, the Bakersfield, California area here in 2023, you're gonna find a lot less biodiversity in the landscape that you're in. Think about it this way. Over the last 100 years or so, as say something like citrus rose and then say grapes for raisins rows, you had a lot more concentration and focus on a single type of plant. That lack of diversity killed off a lot of the natural types of bees and pollinators that existed. And so to counteract this, humans brought in the honeybee. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the typical honeybee that we all think about producing that sweet, delicious honey, that is not native to North America. That insect is actually native to Europe. Europeans brought them here to North America. And if we want to be perfectly honest with ourselves, we have to recognize those honeybees have essentially evolved to become domesticated animals, very much reliant on humans for their survival. It's really not that different than, say, the ducks, geese, or chickens that we have here on our farm. While there are wild versions of ducks, geese, and chickens, the ducks, geese, and chickens that we raise on this farm are not native, much like the honeybees that we raise on this farm are not native. And so if you look at the ecosystem now in the Bakersfield, California area, you have this situation where you have thousands and thousands of acres of almond trees and no natural pollinators to do the pollinating. And then really to top things off, you also have this issue of the fact that when you think about the almond pollination cycle, that's not something that survives year round. That's something that really only happens, like, say, in January and February, and then there's no more pollination for the rest of the year. And because there was such a focus on growing more and more almonds because of the spiking demand of almond crops here in North America, as well as really all around the world, you have a situation now where almonds have become one of the dominant perennial plants that exist in California. And just a fun fact for you guys, you know that California produces about 80% of the world's almonds and pretty much all of the almonds that are consumed here in the United States. And when you see the popularity of things like almond milk, it's no surprise that you have such a great spike in the demand of almonds and the proliferation of almond plants. You know, over the last 20 years or so, almonds have completely taken over California. I mean, this was not something that's been long standing. This really only happened lately. And because you have so many almond trees in one concentrated area, and also such a small concentrated window of pollination for those almonds, you create a situation where you have migrating beehives. What's a migrating beehive, you ask? Well, I would love to tell you. You know, if you actually look at the border of Nevada and California, you know, you go there, say, in like late December or early January, what you're gonna see are truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of bees crossing the border into California. Because when you think about a beehive, it's relatively portable. Like, picture this board that I'm holding here and, like, you know, make it a square or a cube, I should say. I mean, inside that box, you could have like 30,000 bees. And so to very carefully take those bees, stack them up on like a semi-truck trailer bed, and driving them around, you could bring them all over the country. And because of our monoculture, that's essentially the system of beekeeping we have here in the United States, where, you know, you have, say, the almond blossoms that happen in January and February in California, and then maybe you go south down to Florida to pollinate some oranges, and then maybe you come up north to, like, say, Massachusetts to pollinate some fields of cranberries. Our system of monoculture has produced this need for having bees for very, very small periods of time, but then not having the landscape that can support those bees over an extended period of time. And so that's essentially how you end up in a situation where you have mobile beekeepers who their entire livelihood is to go from farm to farm, crop to crop, pollinating, and they get paid for those services. And more specifically, they get paid a pretty penny for those services. You know, when this system of bees for hire first started up in California, like, say, 50, 60 years ago, you know, they were charging like 20 or 30 bucks to park your bees there for a couple of months, and they might even give the farmer some honey in return for the access. But now, if you're looking at what I think 2023 rates were, it was like roughly $320 per hive to park there just for the almond season. And so that demand creates an opportunity, and that opportunity is how we find ourselves in a situation where we have bee thieves. Yes, the bee rustlers are a byproduct of monoculture. You know, I don't mean to trash conventional agriculture in every single video I make, but I don't know. It feels like they're the villain yet again in this story.
So the culprit was capitalism all along.
Because you have a situation that creates a market and a demand for a specific service in the bees, and that is how we get these bee rustlers. But the other issue that's at play here is back in the mid-2000s or so, there was a symptom that people started to detect where hives, beehives, were mysteriously dying off. And the beekeepers who first noticed this felt like if they gave it a catchy name, it might catch some attention. And even though they didn't know exactly what was causing this hive collapse or colony collapse, they recognized that by sharing the news with people and making people aware, they can get money for research and help in trying to solve the problem. Now, I could probably make an entire other video on the topic of colony collapse and the truths and mistruths that exist related to colony collapse, but I'm not going to bore you guys with those details today. But what I will say is colony collapse also plays a role in these bee rustlers. Because look, there's all sorts of things that people could blame colony collapse on, whether it's pesticides and mass spraying, whether it's shifts because of climate change, or arguably the most likely culprit, which is the varroa mite. And now varroa mite, if you're not familiar with it, it's a parasite that feeds on bees. They're actually relatively large too. Like, I mean, if you could picture a person who has like a blood-sucking squirrel attached to them and attacking them, that's essentially the size relationship that you have to a varroa mite. And those varroa mites will transmit all sorts of diseases to the bees. They spread, they proliferate inside the colony, and that can easily kill a colony of bees. Another irony is the varroa mite, I think, developed out in Asia, while meanwhile the honeybee developed in Europe. And so you have the European honeybee with no natural defenses against this Asian bee parasite. That's how you have this situation where entire colonies can collapse as a result of infestations of varroa mites. And I think that it's when you have these colonies that collapse that people turn desperate, and that's where the bee rustlers come from. You see, because the bee rustlers are usually just washed up beekeepers. And when you think about it, it probably makes sense. You know, not any old person can just steal a beehive. You have to actually know how to handle and treat bees. And so that's why most of these bee rustlers are beekeepers themselves, because they have that experience and knowledge. Jeez, I will have seen that. And just in case you're wondering, I've actually never set up one of these hives before, so this is a learning experience for me. And if you talk to a lot of people who are an expert in this situation, a lot of them are going to point to the fact that you have this farmer demand driving up the price of people parking their bees. And then you have people looking around and seeing beehives and saying, hey, it wouldn't be so hard to just steal that person's beehive and repaint it. And if I repaint it, I can just take it to this farmer, leave it at his farm for a couple of weeks, and then move on to somewhere else, and no one would be the wiser. And so it becomes a very easy crime to proliferate. Because as I've said once, I will say it again, without bees, you don't have almonds. And without almonds, you don't have almond milk, and without almond milk you don't have almond lattes, and the American consumer is just not going to stand for that. You know what I mean, guys? You know, one article I read said that there are about 2 million beehives that cross the border into California for that big almond pollination season. And so you think about it, right? That's a lot of beehives in motion, and those beehives in motion create that theft opportunity. Because I mean, like, what's a cop gonna do about stolen bees? I mean, most cops are not trained beekeepers, and so they do not have experience with how to handle those bees. And so if you're reporting like a crime to a cop and they're like, hey, somebody stole my beehive, and the cop shows up and is trying to take a police report and saying, wait, how do you know that that guy's bees are your bees? Like, how can you tell the difference? And you know, bees, it's not like they have different markings, or like you have like ear tags on your bees like you do your cattle or something. And so it's kind of hard for a cop to suss it all out. And so it becomes kind of an easy crime to proliferate. And in my opinion, that's a big reason why beehive theft is such a big thing too. There's about 1 million acres of nut-bearing trees in the state, and there's an additional 330,000 acres that are expected to start to come into maturity in the next 4 or 5 years. You know, as somebody who has their own collection of a whole lot of trees, you have to recognize growing nut trees takes patience, and you got to let it go over a longer period of time. Interestingly enough, the first big beehive heist happened though back in the 1970s, when a guy by the name of David Allred, he ended up stealing about $10,000 worth of bees. And you know, it's funny, actually, during like the whole trial on the theft of these bees, which was very much unprecedented at the time, the district attorney said that Allred wanted to be known as the Jesse James of bees. And Allred had already had like a track record where he'd like gone to jail for poisoning somebody else's bees like a year or two before. And also apparently, and not too long ago, Allred stole like another $30,000 worth of bees. And so this guy is just a career bee thief. But all of that said, my heart does go out to some of these bee thieves because I could picture the situation they're in, right? Like say they make a commitment to a farmer to be at that farmer's farm in January and they have like a $300 per hive price lined up and they operate their business making all those assumptions, and then they get out to their bees one morning to check on them and they find like most of the hive dead and suffering from colony collapse. And now they're panicking and trying to figure out how they're going to meet that commitment to get the bees to that farmer. And that's when they start to turn to nefarious methods and start stealing somebody else's bees. Now you might be hearing about all of this chaos in California and saying, well, my gosh, what could a beekeeper ever do about this situation? And well, the reality is you could do a sting operation like our buddy Joe Romance did at the beginning of this story. Or another option you have is you could potentially find something like GPS. In fact, there's this new company, I think it's called Bee Hero or something like that, where they essentially make like a GPS unit. It slides like right into the frame of a beehive. And so you can like hide it inside your beehive. And so somebody could steal your hive and then you could track them with the GPS and prove that, hey, look, these people stole my hive. And that might be the best solution for you, but that's kind of expensive when you think about it. Like, so say you're getting $325 to park your beehive and you get a GPS unit that's going to cost you, I don't know, a couple $100, and then you got to have monitoring and some sort of subscription to track it. Like all that can get kind of pricey kind of quick, and it'll eat into your margin as the beekeeper. And so I don't know if that's the perfect solution. The other thing is the industry itself is starting to look into more self-pollinating plants. So almond trees that don't require pollination as an option. And so that's the other thing that a lot of folks are looking into right now as well, to try to find a way to, you know, deal with this constant problem of theft. But then also from like the orchardist perspective, it simplifies what they need to do. And they can essentially cut the beekeepers out of this whole situation. But the other thing that I feel like can be done by anybody in the area and anybody with property here in America really is to focus on planting more diverse plants around the landscape, doing things that will help revive the natural pollinators, the native pollinators. You know, by planting those plants that the native pollinators thrive upon, what you're gonna find is a much more likely scenario where you're going to be able to get more biodiversity and have more natural pollinators. I mean, that's the real solution. You know, if you really want to talk about what can help our fragile food system, I think one, it's changing our consumption practices and not focusing on certain things like almond milk so that you're not promoting the monoculture required to create the situation in the first place. And then the second is to focus on creating greater biodiversity, whether that's by planting native plants, supporting landscapes, and supporting farmers who have practices that do those things. And so if you're really out there wondering how can you help the bee stealing problem, it's all about the pollinators, baby, and it's not honeybees. You know, as I assemble this honeybee hive right here, and I'm gonna set it up here in our farm, in our orchard, the idea is I've been trying to learn how to be a beekeeper so that for years to come, I can promote more pollination of my tree crops. But the reality is, and this is something I feel like I've learned over the last couple of years that I didn't even fully appreciate right out of the gate. With as much energy and attention as I put to doing things like keeping honeybees, I also need to shift that energy and attention into trying to protect things like native plants and native pollinators and do things to promote those native pollinators. So yeah, it's definitely a weird world that we live in when you have bee thieves taking over the landscape. Ooh, it's looking pretty good. I think it came out very nicely. And check this out. You can open this side, you can see how much honey you've got. And then when you're ready to harvest your honey, all you have to do is open this guy up. And then you have these little taps and they just slot right in and the honey comes out. I mean, quite honestly, I think it's a brilliant design. And yes, it was a little bit too difficult to try to build this while trying to tell you guys a story. I have no idea how those murder and makeup ladies do it, but I didn't want to leave you guys hanging. So this is the final product. What do you think, little barn cat? She seems rather unimpressed. So after taking 2 hours to build this thing, I sure hope nobody steals my bees this year. Of course, I'm more likely to lose my bees to bears than to thieves.